Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to NarrativeNest. I had always thought my marriage was stable. I mean, we were the picture of success, or at least that's what everyone saw. My husband, Ryan, was charming, ambitious, and seemingly devoted. Our home was beautiful, our careers were thriving, and life had this rhythm that I had come to trust. But the first hint that something was wrong came subtly, like a shadow crossing sunlight. A missed call, a strange expense, the faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine. At first, I brushed it off, convincing myself that I was imagining things. I told myself, I've worked hard, I'm stressed, maybe I'm just overthinking. But the intuition women carry, the one that's stubborn and quiet, it doesn't lie. It hit me fully one Tuesday evening when I was organizing our finances for an upcoming investment. A receipt slipped out of Ryan's jacket pocket, something small, something easily explainable on the surface, but when I called the place listed, I heard a voice on the other end that made my stomach drop. She was married, she had a husband, and he didn't know she was seeing my husband. And suddenly, my neat, controlled life felt like it was unraveling in slow motion. I spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what I had to do next. I had to prepare myself. Preparing to divorce someone isn't just signing papers. It's rebuilding a world you thought was solid into a new version of yourself. I had to be strategic. I couldn't let emotions dictate my actions, though it was tempting. Every time I thought about confronting Ryan, my heart sank and my blood boiled at the same time. Anger, betrayal, sadness, they all collided in a storm that made breathing difficult. By the next morning, I had contacted my lawyer. I wanted to understand my rights, my options, and how to protect myself without making impulsive decisions. I went through my documents meticulously, bank statements, property deeds, our investments, and made a list of questions. This was the part of me that refused to crumble. I could be heartbroken, yes, but I wouldn't be powerless. Then, something completely unexpected happened. I was walking through a cafe downtown, thinking about Ryan, about the affair, and about the divorce proceedings I was planning, when a man approached me. He was in his 50s, well-dressed, confident, but with a certain gravity that made me stop in my tracks. There was something familiar in the way he looked at me, an understanding that felt almost uncanny. "He need to talk to you," he said, his voice calm but firm. I felt my guard rise immediately. Who was this man? What did he want? Anger flared inside me, imagining confronting this man and unleashing a flood of accusations, but he raised his hand, stopping me mid-thought. "I'm not here to fight. I know what's happened, I know about Ryan, and I want to offer you something." Something. That word hung in the air like a riddle. I frowned, my heartbeat accelerating. "Something like what?" I asked cautiously. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope, thick, heavy. I noticed the weight of it before I even realized what it was. He handed it to me with a steady hand. I opened it, and my eyes went wide. The sum inside wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a typo. $100 million. $100 million sitting in crisp, immaculate documents. I could barely comprehend the magnitude of what I was seeing. "I know this seems unbelievable," he said quietly, reading the shock on my face, "but it's my way of making amends. I've lived with the truth, I've watched the betrayal, and I don't want more pain to follow. Take it, use it, whatever you need. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice in whatever form you need it." I froze. My mind spun. Questions, doubts, disbelief. It was too much. Accepting money from the spouse of my husband's mistress felt wrong, and yet part of me couldn't deny the relief it brought. Suddenly, I had options I never imagined, options that could change everything if I were brave enough to act. But the moral questions gnawed at me. Was I complicit if I took it? Was this just another form of manipulation? Or was it genuinely a gesture of someone seeking justice? Could money ever replace the betrayal I felt in my marriage? As I stood there, holding the envelope like it contained both my salvation and my curse, I realized this wasn't just about money, it was about power, agency, and the choices I would make moving forward. And most of all, it was about reclaiming my life from the chaos Ryan had created. I didn't respond immediately. I thanked him, yes, but inside I was reeling, replaying every detail of my marriage, every lie, every stolen secret. I thought about my future, about the family I had, about the friends I trusted, and about the kind of woman I wanted to become once this storm passed. Thomas left after a few minutes, but the echo of that encounter stayed with me. I carried that envelope everywhere, like a talisman of possibility. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faint stirrings of hope, not because of the money, but because the world had offered me a second chance, an unexpected hand in the middle of heartbreak. That night, I sat alone in my study, staring at the city lights beyond my window. I poured myself a glass of wine, my hands trembling slightly, and I allowed myself to finally think freely. What would I do first? How would I prepare for the confrontation with Ryan? And most importantly, how would I honor myself in the midst of all this chaos? I knew one thing for certain. This story wasn't going to end quietly. I wasn't going to be the victim. I wasn't going to be the woman who silently endured betrayal. And somehow, I had a strange, improbable ally who had just changed everything. The next days were a whirlwind of planning, reflection, and preparation. Every phone call, every meeting, every step I took was measured, deliberate. I consulted with my lawyer, revised my financial strategy, and began imagining a life without Ryan, without the lies, without the secrecy, without the constant tension of wondering if today would be the day another betrayal surfaced. Even as I made these plans, I couldn't shake the memory of Thomas. There was something about his calm dignity, his understanding of the human heart, that stayed with me. In a world that had suddenly become cruel and uncertain, he had offered clarity, power, and an unsettling reminder that justice doesn't always look the way we expect. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was anxious, but because I was alive in a way I hadn't been in years. Betrayal had a strange way of stripping you bare, but sometimes, stripped bare, you could finally see the strength you never knew you had. And I knew that strength was about to be tested like never before. The morning after Thomas handed me the envelope felt surreal. I couldn't stop staring at it, the weight of it heavy in my hands, the number blinking in my mind like some impossible dream, $100 million. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Why me? Why not confront Ryan first? Why now? And most importantly, what would accepting it mean? I reminded myself I had to be careful. Every step I took in the coming weeks would define the path my life was about to take. I couldn't let emotion lead me blindly. The divorce had to be clean, calculated, and above all, fair. Ryan had underestimated me for years, believing that I would quietly endure his affairs, that I would be passive, that I would let him dictate the narrative of our lives. He had no idea who he was dealing with. My first move was to gather evidence. I couldn't simply rely on intuition and receipts. I needed concrete proof. I hired a private investigator discreetly, someone who wouldn't raise Ryan's suspicions. Within days, I had detailed records of his affair, messages, meetings, bank transactions. The betrayal became undeniable, a mountain of proof I could lean on when the time came. But while I organized the legal side of things, the emotional side was more complicated. I found myself reliving memories, recalling moments that now felt tainted. Every smile, every "I love you," every shared dream felt like a lie. I questioned how well I truly knew him, and for the first time, I realized how much of myself I had poured into a marriage that wasn't what I thought it was. Then there was Thomas. He reappeared quietly, without fanfare, sending emails instead of calls. Sometimes he would leave subtle notes. Do not rush decisions. Think of yourself first. I didn't fully understand his intentions at first. Why was he helping me? Was it guilt, justice, or something else entirely? And yet, even with my suspicions, I couldn't deny that his guidance, calm, patient, and non-judgmental, was grounding me in the chaos. Ryan, of course, remained blissfully unaware. At least he believed he did. He didn't know I was preparing to strip away the illusion he had created, to take back control of our shared life. I started small, adjusting finances, updating wills, and ensuring that I had independent access to accounts and properties. I felt a thrill in reclaiming agency, in realizing that betrayal had not rendered me powerless. It had, in a strange way, sharpened me. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I had arranged a meeting under the guise of discussing a new investment opportunity. He walked in, smiling as usual, completely oblivious. My heart raced as I led him into the study, closing the door behind us. I could see the confusion flicker across his face, and I realized that part of me wanted to savor this moment, to let him feel the first tremor of the storm he had caused. "Ryan," I began, my voice calm but deliberate, "we need to talk." His smile faltered. "Of course, what is it?" I watched him closely as I laid out everything I knew, every transaction, every meeting, every lie. His face shifted from confusion to denial to anger in a matter of moments, and yet he said nothing that could undo the evidence before him. Then I showed him the envelope. I let my hand linger on it as I watched his eyes widen. He blinked, stunned. How did you get this?" he asked, his voice wavering between disbelief and fear. "Someone wanted to make things right," I said softly, "or at least give me a choice. This isn't just about money, Ryan. It's about power, about control, about finally having a say in my life after years of being blindsided by your lies." He tried to argue, to deflect, to rationalize, but I didn't let him. I had rehearsed this in my mind countless times. I didn't need his approval or his explanations. The betrayal was real, and the consequences were now tangible. As I spoke, I realized something else. This money, this $100 million, wasn't a bribe. It wasn't a way to silence me. It was freedom, a freedom I had never fully imagined, a freedom that allowed me to redefine my life on my own terms. And for the first time since discovering the affair, I felt a spark of something I thought I had lost: hope. Over the following days, I began imagining what I could do with that freedom. I could leave the city, start fresh, and build a life entirely for myself. I could invest in ventures I believed in, help causes I cared about, and reclaim the identity that had been buried under years of compromise and trust misplaced. The possibilities were exhilarating, terrifying, and liberating all at once. But life had its own way of testing my resolve. Gossip started spreading in my circles. People whispered about the affair, about the mistress, and about the mysterious $100 million. I could feel eyes on me everywhere I went, judgment laced with curiosity. Some friends distanced themselves, unsure if they could trust me, or perhaps unsure if they could handle the scandal themselves. It was a painful reminder that betrayal doesn't only hurt the immediate victims, it ripples outward, affecting everyone connected. Through it all, I kept in close contact with Thomas. There was no friendship in the traditional sense, just a shared understanding of the chaos our spouses had caused. He became a sounding board, a mirror reflecting the moral questions I wrestled with daily. Should I accept the money fully, use it strategically, or confront the mistress publicly and expose the web of lies? Each option had consequences. Some I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I also had to prepare emotionally for the divorce proceedings. This wasn't going to be a simple signing of papers. Ryan fought dirty, manipulative in ways I hadn't anticipated. He tried to intimidate me, to make me second-guess myself, to present himself as the victim. But I had done the work. I had prepared. I knew what was coming, and I refused to be manipulated. One evening, while reviewing documents in the quiet of my study, I paused and reflected on how far I had come. From the first shock of betrayal to the surreal gift of freedom from a stranger, I had moved through fear, anger, disbelief, and confusion. And yet, here I was, stronger, more self-aware, and more in control than I had ever been. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was steering my own ship. And I also realized something deeper. This wasn't just about revenge or money. This was about reclaiming dignity, about standing tall in the face of betrayal, and about showing myself that I could survive and thrive no matter how devastating the circumstances. Thomas's gift had been more than financial. It was a catalyst for empowerment, a mirror reflecting the strength I had always possessed, but had allowed to be overshadowed by trust misplaced. And yet, every day, I wrestled with a lingering question. What would I do with this power? How would I wield it without becoming the person I despised in Ryan, the manipulator, the deceiver, the one who caused harm for personal gain? These were questions without easy answers, but they were questions worth asking. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, planning, and reflection. Each day brought new challenges, new moral dilemmas, and new opportunities to assert control over my life. The scandal continued to circulate quietly, whispers carried through social circles, yet I remained grounded, resolute. I had a mission now, not just to navigate a divorce, but to redefine what life could look like after betrayal. And somewhere, quietly, Thomas watched from the sidelines, a reminder that sometimes the world gives you allies in the most unexpected forms. He hadn't saved me from heartbreak, hadn't stopped Ryan's deceit, but he had handed me the tool to reclaim my life. And I intended to use it wisely, not recklessly, not for revenge, but for freedom, justice, and ultimately, my own emotional closure. The days turned into weeks, and every step I took felt like walking on a tightrope. The divorce proceedings were underway, and Ryan was proving to be exactly as I had feared: manipulative, charming when convenient, and dangerously persuasive in court. He tried every tactic to undermine me, questioning my decisions, hinting that I was motivated purely by greed, insinuating that the $100 million was tainted somehow. I had anticipated this, of course, but hearing it out loud, seeing him twist facts with practiced ease, made my blood boil. One afternoon, as I sat across from my lawyer, reviewing yet another barrage of paperwork, I felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about reclaiming my life piece by piece. The money Thomas had given me was a symbol, yes, but it was also a tool that could give me independence, allow me to make choices I never could have made when Ryan controlled the narrative, when his lies dictated my reality. I realized that no matter what the outcome in court, I had already won something far more profound: control over my own destiny. Despite the focus on legal strategy, I couldn't ignore the emotional toll. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake thinking about the betrayal, replaying conversations, imagining how Ryan had smiled at me, feigned love while living a double life. Sometimes I would catch myself crying silently, mourning the life I thought I had, the trust I had misplaced. Yet at the same time, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The pain was raw, yes, but it was proof that I still felt deeply, that I still valued honesty, connection, and integrity. Thomas's presence, though distant, became a steadying force. He never intruded, never imposed advice, but he offered subtle guidance through notes and emails. "Take your time," one message read. "Do not let anger dictate your actions. The right choices are the ones you make for yourself, not to punish anyone else." His words resonated more than I expected. It was easy to get lost in the desire for revenge, to imagine humiliating Ryan or exposing every detail of the affair publicly. But I realized that acting out of anger would only make me complicit in the cycle of deceit. I had to be smarter, better, and more intentional. Meanwhile, Ryan continued to underestimate me. He seemed to believe that the $100 million had made me weak, that I would be dazzled by money and intimidated by his charm. He didn't realize that the money represented freedom, not submission. With each conversation, I practiced restraint, carefully choosing words, observing reactions, and documenting every interaction. Every lie he tried to weave, every accusation he leveled, only reinforced my resolve to dismantle the life he had built on deception. Then came the day I received a call from a journalist. It seemed the affair had leaked into the public domain, and naturally, the $100 million story had followed. The reporter was curious, probing, trying to get a sensational headline. I felt my chest tighten. Exposure had never been part of my plan. I hadn't sought attention, but the world seemed determined to scrutinize every detail. I realized then how complicated it was to navigate a scandal publicly while maintaining personal integrity. I chose not to speak to the press. Instead, I crafted a statement that was measured and dignified, emphasizing the lessons learned and the importance of personal accountability. I refused to vilify anyone publicly, knowing that doing so would only feed the chaos. My lawyer supported the approach, and slowly the narrative shifted. People began to respect the way I handled the situation, admiring the calm strength I displayed amid chaos. The emotional complexity of the situation became even more evident when I unexpectedly ran into the mistress herself, Clarissa, at a mutual friend's event. I had prepared for confrontation, for anger, for tears, but the encounter was different. She approached me quietly, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt, shame, and curiosity. "I never wanted it to go this far," she whispered. I nodded, my expression neutral, letting her words linger without judgment. We didn't exchange accusations or bitterness, but I sensed that a silent understanding passed between us. We were both casualties of choices made, both entwined in a web of betrayal, and yet neither of us was entirely to blame. Seeing Clarissa reminded me of the complexity of human relationships, of the way deception can spread silently, leaving devastation in its wake. I realized that part of my empowerment came from understanding that life isn't always black and white, that villains and victims often coexist in the same narrative. Accepting this complexity allowed me to move forward with clarity rather than vengeance. With the divorce approaching its final stages, I began to think about life after Ryan. What kind of woman did I want to be once the papers were signed, once the legal battles concluded, and once the public scrutiny faded? I imagined a life where I made choices freely, where my happiness wasn't tethered to another's deception, where my identity was fully my own. The $100 million became a tool for that vision, a means to rebuild, to invest in ventures I had always dreamed of, and to secure a future unshackled from past betrayals. Then, one evening, Thomas reached out again. "Meet me," he wrote. "I have something to show you." I hesitated. After all that had happened, part of me wondered if this was another test, another moral dilemma disguised as opportunity. But curiosity won. I agreed. When we met, he handed me a folder containing documents I hadn't anticipated. It detailed assets, hidden accounts, and financial maneuvers Ryan had engaged in, proof not only of the affair, but also of his attempts to manipulate wealth and obscure assets during the divorce process. I felt a mix of shock and vindication. Every move he tried to make in secrecy was now transparent, and I held the leverage I needed to ensure fairness and accountability. Use this wisely, Thomas advised. This isn't about revenge. This is about making sure you are protected, that justice is served in a way that benefits you, not out of anger. I nodded, silently acknowledging the gravity of the moment. For the first time, I felt fully in control, not just of my immediate situation, but of the narrative of my life. The next days were consumed with meticulous planning. Every meeting with lawyers, every strategy session, every calculated move against Ryan was purposeful. I wasn't being ruthless, I was being deliberate. I refused to let him manipulate outcomes through charm, intimidation, or deceit. The woman who had walked into the cafe weeks ago, shocked and betrayed, had transformed into someone who could navigate treachery with intelligence and composure. Yet, despite the empowerment, there were still moments of vulnerability. At night, I would sit quietly, reflecting on what I had lost, on what could never be regained. But those moments were brief, overshadowed by a growing sense of clarity and determination. I realized that strength wasn't the absence of pain, it was the ability to move forward despite it. Thomas's presence, though distant, remained a quiet presence in the background, a reminder that sometimes allies appear in the most unexpected forms. He hadn't saved me from heartbreak, hadn't stopped Ryan's betrayal, but he had offered a tool, a way to reclaim control, assert agency, and rebuild a life defined not by deception, but by personal choice and integrity. As I walked through my empty home one evening, imagining how I would fill it with new memories, new ventures, and new possibilities, I realized that this story, my story, was no longer just about betrayal. It was about survival, empowerment, and the unexpected ways life can offer second chances when we least expect them. Even after the divorce was finalized, there were moments when I still felt the sting of betrayal. It wasn't just about losing Ryan, it was about losing the version of myself who believed in trust, who thought our marriage was safe. That version of me had to be mourned, quietly and privately, because grief is part of reclaiming power. I remember one night, sitting alone in the living room, the envelope with Thomas's $100 million long gone into my investment accounts, and realizing that the weight of what I'd endured wasn't something a number could erase. Money didn't fix heartbreak. It offered freedom, yes, but healing required more. I decided to invest in myself first. Therapy became a cornerstone of my new routine. Talking to someone who could help me untangle feelings of betrayal, shame, and anger was transformative. I realized that the deepest wound wasn't the affair itself, it was the illusion of security I had built my life on. Every night I replayed small moments, memories that now carried double meanings, and slowly, with professional guidance, I began to see patterns instead of pain. I started to understand my instincts, my intuition, and why I had been right to trust my gut all along. Thomas remained a subtle presence in my life. He never forced contact, but sometimes a note or message would arrive. Strength is measured not by what you hold, but by what you choose to release, one read. His words echoed in my mind, particularly during moments of doubt or loneliness. It was strange, this connection with someone I barely knew, but it grounded me. He had entered my life at a point of utter chaos and given me perspective, and while money had been the obvious gift, the real gift was guidance, clarity, and a model of integrity I could hold on to. The financial freedom from Thomas's unexpected $100 million changed my life in practical ways, too. I sold the house Ryan and I had shared. Walking through that space one last time, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and relief. Each room had memories of laughter and love, but also of betrayal and lies. Selling it wasn't just about money, it was symbolic. I was letting go of the past and claiming a future that belonged entirely to me. I purchased a new home, a place that felt like mine from the ground up. Minimalist, bright, and open, it reflected the clarity and openness I wanted in my life. It wasn't ostentatious. It wasn't about showing off wealth. It was about creating a space that nurtured peace, reflection, and growth. Every choice, from the furniture to the layout, was deliberate, designed to reflect the woman I had become, resilient, independent, and emotionally grounded. As I settled into this new chapter, I began to reflect on the social ripples of the scandal. Friends and colleagues who had once been close became distant, unsure how to navigate the gossip or scandal associated with my divorce and the $100 million revelation. It was painful, but also illuminating. I realized that true connections withstand storms. They aren't conditional on appearances or financial circumstances. This period weeded out superficial relationships, leaving only those who valued me for my character rather than circumstance. Meanwhile, Ryan tried to resurface in public spaces, subtly attempting to reclaim influence over mutual acquaintances. I ignored it. There was a time I would have reacted, a time when his charm and manipulation might have shaken me, but no longer. The woman he had tried to deceive and undermine had grown stronger through the ordeal. My focus shifted entirely to building, not reacting. Every action I took was constructive, a brick laid toward a life fully my own. I also began to consider using the money to empower others. While initially it had felt like a personal lifeline, I realized it could be more than that. I started small, investing in initiatives for women who had been betrayed, abandoned, or manipulated in personal or professional contexts. Providing mentorship, funding for education, and safe spaces for emotional recovery became part of my journey. In doing so, I discovered a deeper sense of purpose, a way to transform personal trauma into societal benefit. One evening, months after the divorce, I received a call from Clarissa, the mistress. This time, the conversation was different. She didn't approach with shame or guilt, but with curiosity and perhaps a hint of admiration. She said, "I've been watching what you've done. It's impressive. I never imagined I'd see someone rise so fully after betrayal." I didn't respond immediately. I felt no anger, no judgment. Instead, I felt empathy. "It's not easy," I said finally, "but it's possible. Everyone has choices, even when the world seems to conspire against you." That conversation, brief as it was, reinforced my belief that empowerment comes not from revenge, but from intentional action, moral clarity, and self-respect. As the months rolled on, I noticed changes in myself that weren't just financial or social, but deeply emotional. I laughed more freely. I slept without fear or lingering suspicion. I allowed myself to dream again, to imagine a future that wasn't haunted by Ryan's deceit. Small victories like planning a solo vacation, attending an art show, or simply enjoying a quiet evening at home reminded me daily that freedom is both practical and emotional. Yet, life's lessons were still unfolding. I realized that no matter how much control I had, I couldn't fully predict the actions of others. People would gossip, attempt manipulation, or even seek to undermine me. But I had learned to choose my battles, to weigh consequences, and to prioritize my own integrity above all else. The betrayal had been a catalyst, painful and unjust, but it had forced me to confront realities I might otherwise have ignored. The most surprising transformation, however, was in how I perceived justice. Initially, I had thought of justice in simplistic terms, punishing Ryan, exposing the mistress, asserting dominance. But through reflection and guidance, I realized justice was more subtle, more personal. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't public humiliation. It was reclaiming agency, making deliberate choices that aligned with values rather than anger, and building a life defined by self-respect, empowerment, and emotional resilience. One day, as I reviewed my investment plans and personal projects, I paused to consider Thomas, the man who handed me $100 million, who had appeared out of nowhere, had changed the trajectory of my life. He didn't dictate what I should do. He didn't tell me how to live. He simply provided an opportunity and a lens through which to view my circumstances differently. In a strange way, his intervention was a test of character, and I had passed, not by amassing wealth, but by proving to myself that I could navigate betrayal with integrity. I remember sitting in my garden that evening, watching the sunset, and realizing something fundamental. I had been broken, yes, but not defeated. I had been betrayed, yes, but not diminished. Every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had been a step toward reclaiming my life. And now, months later, I could finally see the horizon clearly, unshadowed by deception or fear. The story of Ryan, the affair, and the $100 million had become a narrative I could control, not through anger, not through revenge, but through deliberate choice. I had learned that empowerment isn't about wealth alone. It's about emotional intelligence, resilience, and moral clarity. And while some might focus on the shock value, the scandal, or the money, the real transformation was internal. Life after the divorce wasn't immediately peaceful, but it was honest. I had shed the illusion of security I once clung to, and in that shedding, I found clarity. The world no longer felt like a cage of lies. It was open, unpredictable, and full of possibilities I had never allowed myself to imagine. Every morning, waking up in my new home, I felt the weight of that betrayal lift little by little, replaced by a sense of autonomy I had never experienced before. The $100 million, once a shock that made my head spin, had been carefully allocated. I set aside a portion for personal investments, creating a foundation that would support both practical needs and passions I had long ignored. Another portion went into philanthropy, funding initiatives for women who, like me, had experienced betrayal, abuse, or injustice in their relationships. This was more than charity. It was transformation. I was turning the pain of my past into a legacy that could empower others. And in doing so, I discovered a satisfaction that money alone could never bring. Yet, there were still challenges. Ryan attempted to regain influence through mutual acquaintances, trying to tarnish my image subtly, but I had learned to navigate the shadows. Each attempt at manipulation was met with calm strategy. I refused to be reactive. Instead, I focused on building, on creating a life grounded in my own vision. I realized that strength isn't the absence of vulnerability, it's the ability to act deliberately despite it. Unexpectedly, I also found a surprising kind of closure with Clarissa. Our interactions remained infrequent but civil. There was no bitterness, no confrontation, just acknowledgement. We shared a mutual understanding of the chaos our spouses had caused, and in a strange way, a sense of solidarity. One afternoon, she said quietly, "You've handled this with more grace than I could have imagined. I'm learning from your strength." Her words caught me off guard. I didn't feel pride exactly. I felt validation. It wasn't about ego. It was about recognizing that integrity and composure were stronger than anger and retaliation. Thomas continued to be a quiet, guiding presence. Occasionally, he would reach out with a note or a call, reminding me of the choices I had, of the principles I had committed to. "Remember," he said once, "control isn't about holding power over others, it's about holding power over yourself." That lesson became my mantra. The past, no matter how painful, had shaped me, but it did not define me. The future was mine to create. Social dynamics shifted as well. Some friends distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the scandal and the wealth involved. Others approached cautiously, unsure if they could trust me or if I had changed too much. I realized that betrayal often exposes true friendships. Those who remained were genuine, their support unshakable. It was humbling, and it reinforced the value of surrounding myself with people who respected integrity over appearances. Financially, I became meticulous. Ryan's attempts to manipulate assets were rendered moot because I had anticipated every contingency. Thomas's unexpected intervention had not only given me freedom, but also provided leverage and protection. For the first time in years, I felt fully in command of my financial life, my decisions guided by strategy rather than fear or deception. Despite the progress, there were moments of reflection that were unavoidable. I would think about what my life might have been like if Ryan had remained faithful. I would replay moments of deception, wondering how I had missed the signs. These reflections were not about recrimination, they were about understanding and learning. I realized that awareness, intuition, and self-trust are as critical as love and companionship in any relationship. Ignoring them leaves you vulnerable. As I rebuilt my life, I also explored new passions. I started attending art exhibitions, volunteering with organizations focused on women's empowerment, and even began mentoring young professionals navigating complex careers and relationships. These activities weren't distractions, they were part of the healing, a way to reclaim joy and purpose that had been overshadowed by betrayal. The freedom to travel alone was another revelation. For the first time in years, I booked a solo trip, immersing myself in new cities, cultures, and experiences. Without Ryan's shadow, I felt liberated, curious, and alive. Every conversation with strangers, every sunset viewed alone, became a reminder that life could be expansive and fulfilling even after heartbreak. There were also moments when I caught myself imagining confrontation with Ryan, running into him at a public event, responding to accusations, but I no longer craved revenge. What mattered wasn't proving him wrong, it was proving to myself that I could thrive independently. That realization, subtle yet profound, became the foundation of my empowerment. Months after the divorce, I began to see the full scope of what had happened. The affair, the betrayal, the sudden appearance of Thomas, all of it had forced me to confront who I truly was and what I valued. Money, while transformative, was secondary. What mattered most was my resilience, my ability to choose integrity over spite, and my commitment to living authentically. Thomas's gift, in retrospect, was symbolic as much as financial. It represented opportunity, but also moral responsibility. Accepting the money required discernment. Using it wisely required judgment. In navigating that, I had learned lessons that extended far beyond wealth, about trust, agency, and self-respect. I had discovered that empowerment isn't given, it's cultivated through deliberate, sometimes difficult choices. The final piece of the journey involved reflection on the people I had been and the person I had become. I often thought about the nights of despair, the moments of doubt, and the gnawing fear that my life would never feel whole again. Yet here I was, standing in a home of my own, fully aware of my financial and emotional independence, surrounded by genuine friends and guided by lessons that would stay with me forever. And even as I embraced this new life, I knew the story wasn't just mine. It belonged to anyone who had been betrayed, anyone who had felt powerless, anyone who believed that the past would dictate their future. My journey was proof that transformation is possible, that integrity and resilience can turn pain into purpose, and that unexpected allies sometimes arrive in the most improbable forms. The affair, the betrayal, and the $100 million were chapters in a larger story, one about reclaiming agency, discovering strength, and understanding that freedom, once seized, is life-changing. And though the emotional scars remained, they were no longer wounds. They were markers of survival, proof that I had endured, adapted, and emerged stronger than I ever imagined possible. Would you like me to continue to part 6 with 1,300 words? Continue to part 6. As time passed, I began to understand that healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers, quietly, often when you're not looking for it. There were mornings when I woke up and forgot, just for a second, that my marriage had ended in betrayal. Those moments were small victories, reminders that pain doesn't stay sharp forever. It softens, reshapes itself, and eventually becomes part of the story rather than the center of it. I also noticed how differently people treated me now. Some saw me as a cautionary tale, others as an object of curiosity, and a few as a symbol of strength. At first, those projections unsettled me. I didn't want to be defined by scandal or money. I wanted to be known for my values, my choices, and the quiet dignity with which I had handled chaos. Slowly, I learned to detach from others' perceptions. Their interpretations were reflections of their own fears and desires, not my responsibility to manage. One afternoon, while attending a small conference on ethical investing, I found myself sharing my story, not the sensational parts, but the lessons. I spoke about betrayal, resilience, and the importance of financial independence for emotional freedom. The room was silent, attentive. When I finished, several women approached me with tears in their eyes. They shared stories of their own, husbands who cheated, partners who controlled finances, lives shaped by fear and silence. In those moments, I realized my experience had evolved into something larger than myself. It had become a bridge, a way to connect, to empower, to remind others that survival is possible. That realization gave me direction. I began formalizing the work I had been doing informally, creating a foundation focused on supporting women navigating betrayal and financial vulnerability. We offered legal resources, counseling access, and educational programs designed to restore agency. Watching women reclaim control over their lives filled me with a quiet pride. This wasn't about revenge or proving anything to Ryan, it was about purpose. Ryan, for his part, faded into the background. Occasionally, I would hear rumors, failed ventures, strained relationships, attempts to rebuild his image, but they no longer mattered. I felt no satisfaction in his struggles, no desire to watch him fall. Indifference had replaced anger, and that, I learned, was true freedom. When someone no longer has emotional access to you, they lose their power. Thomas and I met again months after everything had settled. This time, it wasn't about documents or strategy. We sat in a quiet cafe. As time passed, I began to understand that healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers, quietly, often when you're not looking for it. There were mornings when I woke up and forgot, just for a second, that my marriage had ended in betrayal. Those moments were small victories, reminders that pain doesn't stay sharp forever. It softens, reshapes itself, and eventually becomes part of the story rather than the center of it. I also noticed how differently people treated me now. Some saw me as a cautionary tale, others as an object of curiosity, and a few as a symbol of strength. At first, those projections unsettled me. I didn't want to be defined by scandal or money. I wanted to be known for my values, my choices, and the quiet dignity with which I had handled chaos. Slowly, I learned to detach from others' perceptions. Their interpretations were reflections of their own fears and desires, not my responsibility to manage. One afternoon, while attending a small conference on ethical investing, I found myself sharing my story, not the sensational parts, but the lessons. I spoke about betrayal, resilience, and the importance of financial independence for emotional freedom. The room was silent, attentive. When I finished, several women approached me with tears in their eyes. They shared stories of their own, husbands who cheated, partners who controlled finances, lives shaped by fear and silence. In those moments, I realized my experience had evolved into something larger than myself. It had become a bridge, a way to connect, to empower, to remind others that survival is possible. That realization gave me direction. I began formalizing the work I had been doing informally, creating a foundation focused on supporting women navigating betrayal and financial vulnerability. We offered legal resources, counseling access, and educational programs designed to restore agency. Watching women reclaim control over their lives filled me with a quiet pride. This wasn't about revenge or proving anything to Ryan. It was about purpose. Ryan, for his part, faded into the background. Occasionally, I would hear rumors, failed ventures, strained relationships, attempts to rebuild his image, but they no longer mattered. I felt no satisfaction in his struggles, no desire to watch him fall. Indifference had replaced anger, and that, I learned, was true freedom. When someone no longer has emotional access to you, they lose their power. Thomas and I met again, months after everything had settled. This time, it wasn't about documents or strategy. We sat in a quiet cafe, two people bound by an unusual chapter of life. He looked lighter somehow, as if releasing the money and the secret burden it carried had freed him too. "You did well," he said simply. "You didn't let bitterness shape you." I thanked him, acknowledging that without his unexpected intervention, my path might have been far more difficult. But I also knew that the strength to choose integrity had always been mine. We talked about life, about loss, about the strange ways justice manifests. He admitted that giving me the money had been his way of closing a painful chapter, of refusing to let deceit be the final word. I understood that deeply. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment, it's about balance, about restoring what was taken in a way that allows everyone to move forward. After that meeting, I felt a sense of completion, not closure, because closure implies finality, but completion, a feeling that the circle had closed. The betrayal no longer defined my present. It had shaped me, yes, but it no longer controlled me. I returned home that evening and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of this journey, confused, hurt, bracing herself for a divorce she never wanted. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that she would survive, that she would grow stronger, and that her life would expand in ways she couldn't yet imagine. There were still moments of loneliness. Healing doesn't erase the human need for connection, but I no longer feared being alone. Solitude taught me self-trust, self-respect, and the ability to listen to my own voice. I knew that if love entered my life again, it would be built on honesty, equality, and mutual respect, or not at all. As I prepared for the next phase of my life, I reflected on the moral of everything I had endured. Betrayal tests character, money tests values, power tests integrity. It's easy to lose yourself when all three collide. What matters is not what you're given, but what you do with it. I had been handed an unimaginable sum, yes, but more importantly, I had been handed a choice, and I chose growth over revenge, purpose over bitterness, and self-respect over silence. The story that once felt like a nightmare had transformed into a lesson. Not a fairy tale, not a triumph without scars, but a real human journey marked by pain, reflection, and resilience. I no longer asked why this happened to me. Instead, I asked what I could become because of it. And as I moved forward, grounded and clear-eyed, I knew there was still one final chapter to tell. Not about betrayal or money, but about meaning, about how everything I had endured came together in a way that finally made sense. By the time a full year had passed since the divorce papers were signed, my life no longer felt like something I was recovering from. It felt like something I was actively living. That distinction mattered more than I ever expected. Recovery implies damage control, survival mode, waiting for the pain to lessen. Living, on the other hand, means agency. It means intention, and intention had quietly become the foundation of everything I did. The foundation's work deepened. We weren't just helping women leave difficult situations anymore. We were helping them redefine themselves afterward. I sat in rooms where women whispered truths they had never said out loud. I watched shoulders straighten when they realized their fear didn't make them weak, it made them human. Every story echoed pieces of my own, and yet each one reminded me that betrayal wears many faces. What unites us is not what was done to us, but what we choose to do next. There were days I left those meetings emotionally drained, carrying the weight of so many lives intersecting with mine. On those evenings, I would return home, sit in silence, and remind myself why I started. Pain shared responsibly becomes purpose. Pain ignored becomes poison. I had chosen purpose. My public life continued to grow in unexpected ways. Invitations came from universities, financial institutions, and women's leadership forums. I spoke not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who had lived the questions. I talked about financial independence not as a luxury, but as a form of emotional safety. I talked about trust, not as blind faith, but as something earned and protected. And every time I spoke, I felt a little more aligned with the woman I had become. Ryan remained absent, though his shadow lingered less and less. Occasionally, someone would mention his name in passing, usually followed by an awkward silence. I learned to smile gently and change the subject. I no longer needed to defend my past or explain my choices. The story had moved on, and so had I. One afternoon, while reorganizing my study, I came across the very first notes I had made when I suspected the affair. Lists, dates, fragments of doubt scribbled in the margins. I sat there for a long time, holding those papers, feeling a deep tenderness for the woman who wrote them. She had known something was wrong long before she had proof. She had doubted herself, minimized her instincts, tried to preserve peace at her own expense. I wished I could tell her what I know now, that intuition is not paranoia and silence is not strength. That realization marked another turning point. I began speaking openly about intuition and self-trust, especially with younger women, not in a dramatic way, but practically. Listen to patterns, watch actions, pay attention to how your body responds when something feels off. Those signals exist to protect you, not to be ignored. Clarissa and I crossed paths one last time at a charity event. There was no tension, no discomfort, just a brief nod, a quiet acknowledgement of a shared past we had both outgrown. I felt no resentment, no superiority, only closure. That surprised me most of all. It was proof that healing had done its work. As for the money, it had fully faded into the background of my identity. It existed, yes, but it no longer defined conversations or relationships in my life. Those who stayed close to me knew better. They knew my values, my boundaries, my priorities. Wealth can amplify who you are, but it cannot replace character. If anything, it demands more of it. One evening, I hosted a small dinner for women who had been part of the Foundation's earliest programs. Laughter filled my home. Stories overlapped. There was warmth, ease, and something else, belonging. As I watched them, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for what I had endured, but for what I had built because I endured it. Later that night, after everyone had left, I stood alone in the quiet and reflected on the journey. I thought about the shock of discovery, the envelope in the cafe, the fear of divorce, the temptation of revenge. I thought about the moments when I could have hardened, closed off, or chosen bitterness, and I felt proud, not in a loud way, but in a grounded, settled way, that I hadn't. I understood now that betrayal doesn't end a life, it interrupts it. What follows depends entirely on how you respond to that interruption. You can cling to what was, or you can build what will be. I chose to build, slowly, intentionally, without losing myself in the process. The woman I am now is not flawless, but she is whole. She trusts herself, she honors her boundaries, she knows that love should never require self-erasure, and she understands that justice is not always loud, it is often quiet, steady, and deeply personal. There is only one thing left to say, one final reflection that brings this story to rest, not with drama, but with truth. The last lesson came to me quietly, long after the courtrooms, the headlines, the whispers, and the shock had faded. It came on an ordinary afternoon when I realized I'd no longer measured my life by what I had lost, but by what I had gained clarity about. That shift didn't happen overnight. It was earned through discomfort, through restraint, through choosing dignity when outrage would have been easier. I used to think closure was something another person gave you, an apology, an explanation, a moment where everything finally made sense. But closure, I learned, is something you grant yourself. It's the decision to stop reopening wounds that have already taught you what you needed to know. It's the acceptance that not every betrayal comes with a confession, and not every injustice comes with public accountability. Sometimes peace is the only justice you'll ever get, and sometimes it's the best one. Ryan never apologized, not truly, and strangely, that stopped mattering. I no longer needed him to acknowledge the damage he caused for my healing to be valid. I had already rebuilt a life that no longer made space for dishonesty. His silence became irrelevant the moment my self-respect stopped asking for validation. The foundation continued its work quietly, steadily. Not everything needed to be public. The real victories happened behind closed doors, when a woman opened her own bank account for the first time, when another found the courage to leave, when someone sat across from me and said, "I finally trust myself again." Those moments reminded me that pain, when handled with care, can become a blueprint for something meaningful. Occasionally, people would still ask me if I ever felt angry about how everything unfolded. I always paused before answering, because anger is a complex thing. I had felt it deeply, but I didn't let it settle into me. I treated it like a signal, not a residence. Anger pointed me toward boundaries. It showed me where I had been wronged. Then I let it go. Carrying it longer would have meant letting the betrayal continue to live rent-free inside me. There was a moment, late one night, when I found myself thinking again about that cafe, the first meeting with Thomas, the envelope and the disbelief. It struck me how surreal it all had been, how easily that moment could have pushed me in a very different direction. I could have used that money to disappear, to numb myself, to prove something to the world. Instead, I used it to stand still long enough to decide who I wanted to be. That choice changed everything. Thomas's role in my life remained what it always was, a catalyst, not a companion. I never tried to define it beyond that. Some people enter your story to teach you something essential, then step away. Forcing permanence onto temporary connections only dilutes their purpose. I was grateful, and then I let it rest. As the years unfolded, my life became quieter in the best possible way. Fewer explanations, fewer compromises, fewer sleepless nights questioning my worth. I learned to enjoy my own company, to trust my instincts without second-guessing them, and to recognize peace when it arrived instead of mistaking it for boredom. Love, when it eventually returned to my life in small, cautious ways, felt different. There was no urgency, no need to be chosen. I no longer auditioned for affection. I showed up as I was, knowing that anything built on pretense would eventually collapse. Whether love stayed or went, I knew I would remain intact. That knowledge alone was revolutionary. If there is one truth I hope stays with anyone listening to this, it's this. Betrayal does not strip you of your value. It reveals who was benefiting from your silence. What you do with that revelation determines everything that comes next. I didn't emerge from this story flawless or untouched. I emerged aware, aware of my boundaries, aware of my strength, aware that justice doesn't always look like punishment and empowerment doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it looks like walking away with your integrity intact and your future unburdened. The woman I am now does not fear endings. She understands that some endings are acts of self-respect. She knows that wealth without wisdom is noise, and that freedom without self-trust is fragile. She knows that dignity is built choice by choice, especially when no one is watching. This story didn't end with revenge. It didn't end with riches. It ended with alignment, with a life that finally matched my values. And that, more than anything else, is what made all the pain worth surviving. If you are standing at the edge of your own breaking point, wondering whether you'll recognize yourself on the other side, let me tell you this: you will, and you may like that version of yourself even more.